Yeah, because even if I zoom in, you still see the whole the working window of all the stuff.
Yeah, but
that looks okay.
it's big enough that it's not that much
Different.
different than if you were full screen or if you're slideshow.
How does that look?
I think it looks good.
I agree.
But well, you know what I lose? I lose my animations.
Oh yeah, the trade-off. You're right.
Yeah, I forgot about. Yeah, I lose my animations, and I can't do my animations. I'll have to figure out. By the time I figure out the pointer, I won't need it. That'll be the writing on the wall there.
Just have to be very descriptive.
Mm-hmm.
In the upper right-hand corner of your.
Yeah. Well, I go to maps every now and then, and that's why that is helpful.
I love maps. Cool.
But let me get back to the presentation. Back to here. All right. Well, we're 2 minutes out. So now is the time when it was going to be going live on the live stream. So that's the cross your fingers. I hope this works on the live stream, and see if it actually goes out to the live stream and people can watch it.
You want me to check it?
From their home? Sure. Well, yeah, we're about a minute out now, so it should be going live on the live stream.
Okay, let me double check.
And the people that are joining on the live stream, some of them might be a little curious on, well, what's happening here? You know, I see a bunch of windows, a bunch of people. But we got a nice little group on at least the Zoom component. And then what we can do is when we get rolling, I'll have everybody mute themselves. Everyone's muted anyway upon entry. And then so we don't get a lot of background noise. And then those that want to join, that are watching on the live stream, they won't get bogged down. We'll get a little bit of a late start today, I think, because
it's coming through on live stream.
It is?
Yep.
Amen.
A little bit of delay,
the technology actually worked.
You're here too.
Okay, so it's 6:30. So we've got our group that's on the Zoom call, and we have our group that's joined us through our live stream via whether it's Facebook, YouTube, the website, or our Boxcast app and Boxcast channel. Folks have joined us. So for those that are on the live stream, you might be wondering what it is that I'm looking at. You're looking at a live stream of a Zoom meeting. So we're hosting a Zoom meeting, and people are logging into the Zoom call. And what we're going to do is I'll move into my presentation, and the Zoom allows me to put my presentation up onto the screen, and everyone can see it, and I can continue to talk and explain what I went through in Israel. I'll start with, now that we're really officially rolling, I'll start with a brief background on what it was that I actually did. I joined a pilgrimage, and it was very different than a tour. And if we get far enough, I actually have a little slide that differentiates between a tour and a pilgrimage. And whereas a tour is, you're kind of touristy, and a pilgrimage is a designed trek through the Holy Land that intentionally takes you not only to all of the sites, but there is an intentionality to a spiritual walk and a progression that you're going through. For those that have been through something like Curcio or Tres Dias or Walk to Emmaus or something like that, you know, that in a sense is its own mini pilgrimage. It's a designed start to finish experience. And this pilgrimage that I was on is something similar. It had a start, middle, and ending. And there was, you know, the quote tour aspect of it, where we're seeing the sights. But then again, every component of it was intentionally designed that we're also on a spiritual journey. We're also on a journey through the life of Jesus. We're also on a journey of kind of the history of the Hebrews and the Jewish people, and then you know, the modern context of the relationship that currently exists between the Israelis and the Palestinians and things like that. So it was a multi-layered experience that it was 2 weeks long, intensive. I mean, we went to multiple sites a day all over the country of Israel. Just it was really cool. I just have to say that it was one of the neatest experiences of my life. It's for the folks who are the Episcopalians in Florida. What I went on was actually a ministry that was birthed here in the Diocese of Southwest Florida, and the ministry is called Behold the Man, and that comes from the passage of John when Jesus is standing on trial, and Pilate says to the crowd, "Behold the man," and that's the name of this pilgrimage. And it's a men's ministry that got started by a gentleman by the name of Jay Krause. And he was in our diocese, and men's ministry was his passion. And he went to Israel for the first time way back when. I think it was 12, 15 years ago. And it just changed his whole outlook on his entire faith. And he began to shift his men's ministry that was local in the diocese to a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. He felt that that was his new calling in life, that I'm going to take my men's ministry now to Israel. And he started developing this pilgrimage over time. Somehow, I forget how it evolved, but he became so enthralled by the idea of taking these groups of men to the Holy Land. He became aware that a significant number of priests in the diocese had never been to the Holy Land. And then all of a sudden, he added a new element to this pilgrimage, which was he intentionally took priests, usually new priests to the diocese, maybe been there 2 or 3 years, and he would, through the grapevine, he would find out your name, and then he would invite you to go completely free of charge. He had a fundraiser. He was out of a Church of the Redeemer in Sarasota, and Church of the Redeemer is very well financially endowed. And he would do fundraisers, and they would raise the monies to take clergy free of charge on this pilgrimage. Long story short, Jay ultimately moved to, where is he at? South Carolina now. And he took the ministry there, and he's involved now in the Anglican Church in South Carolina, but he still has the ties to the Diocese of Southwest Florida, and he still brings a priest from the Diocese of Southwest Florida who's never been to the Holy Land. He will call and contact and invite you to go. And I got the call. I had heard about it through the grapevine from some of my other clergy friends. And lo and behold, I got an email one day from Jay, and he introduced himself and he invited me to go. And it's completely free of charge, like the pilgrimage, the airfare, everything. So talk about an absolute blessing. That is amazing, and a ministry that Jay does. So that's the genesis of all of this, and that's how this happened. I agreed to go. I think Caroline, when I went, she was about 7 months old, and then I left the country for 2.5 weeks and left my wife Sarah high and dry with the baby and ran around the Holy Land. So I always joke, and I tell her that I owe her that trip to Rome big time one of these days. for me taking off and going to the Holy Land by myself. So that's what happened. And when I got back, I developed a teaching, a rather in-depth teaching, a PowerPoint series that has hundreds of slides. And I've done different versions of the teaching, and even the quote quick version of the teaching, I think still spans about 3 months of one meeting a night for 2 hours. That's the level of depth that this thing goes into, and how much content we actually cover. I broke it down into these half-hour teachings after worship services over at Church of the Ascension. I think it took 6 months to get through it all. And we were doing those once a week also. So what you're going to see over the next 6 Wednesday nights is a very abridged version of that. I've got to cut a lot of it out because we saw a lot of other sites that we just simply won't be able to get to in this teaching. But what I hope to do is eventually, when COVID is past and we get all this behind us and we're back to normal operation there in at Holy Trinity, I'll do the full teaching at some point. It does work a whole lot better in person, where you can have a lot of in-person conversation. As I was talking to some of those who joined early, this is designed to be kind of projected, and I need a laser pointer to point to things. And I have yet to figure out how I get the pointer to work in Zoom when I'm screen sharing. That'll be a homework assignment for me between now and next week to see if that's possible. Because when I screen share, my pointer goes away. So I'm going to have to descriptively tell you what to look at to the best of my ability. But it does really work better when it's all in person. So, in regards to tonight, what I'd like to do tonight is, and this is how I start everything, all of the teachings, is instead of diving right into the sites, what I like to do is a full kind of history of the nation of Israel, how we got from the biblical narrative to the country that we now have today. And again, keep in mind, this is a very broad generalization of a very complex history. And I just hit the highlights. Please understand, if there's any history majors on the call, I am not going to go to any level of depth that would be acceptable in the academic world. But at least I hit the highlights so we understand kind of how we got to where we are today. So that's what we're going to talk about mostly tonight, and see how far we get. If we got a little extra time, I'll jump into the next topic, but if not, we'll call it quits. So what I need to do now is screen share my presentation. So give me just 2 seconds, and here we go. So let me do this. Perfect. So Holy Land Pilgrimage, I did this in the September of 2018 was when I went. And that's me in the Holy Land, standing, I believe that is in the area called the Wadi Kelt. We may not talk about that. The Wadi Kelt, just so you briefly know, it would be the area that has been theorized where Jesus went into the wilderness. So we recently talked about that just this past Sunday, about Jesus being driven into the wilderness. This area where we are is due west of the Jordan River, in the site around where they think Jesus might have been baptized. And it's in between, basically in between Jericho and Jerusalem. There's this area called the Wadi Kelt. And it is theorized that if Jesus went west out of the river, this is where he would have gone into for the wilderness time. If he went east on the river side, he would have gone into what's modern day Jordan, and we didn't go over there this year. So, but anyway, moving on along. So where is Israel? I like to start with this question. And again, this is fun to do in a group. We always ask people, could you point to Israel on a map? So if I show a big picture of Africa, Europe, the Mediterranean, how many people know exactly where Israel is if you're looking at this map? And it's always fun. And if I had the pointer, that I would point to it at certain point once people try to figure out where it is. But we're zooming in on it now. So you've got northern Egypt, you get the Mediterranean Sea, you see Turkey there, you've got the big peninsula that we know as Saudi Arabia, you got Jordan, and then there's Israel. You see it? We're going to zoom in just a little more. And this is Israel right here. Tiny, tiny little country. It's not that big at all. Now, geography of Israel. It's only 290 miles north to south, 85 miles east-west. The highest elevation is 7,336 feet, but the lowest elevation is 1,380 feet below sea level. We talked about the Jordan River back at the Jesus baptism, and I said it's one of the lowest spots on earth, and the Dead Sea, which is half located in Israel, is here. That's the lowest spot on earth that is above water, 1,385 feet below sea level. So the interesting thing here is it's a small country, but yet it's got some pretty high peaks and some really low lows, far lower than New Orleans. Let's just put it that way. So here's a fun graphic. We all are familiar with the state of Florida and its size. Almost everyone on the call, though we do have some visitors from Austin on the Zoom call. Everyone here is from Florida, and you know what it's like to drive from Tampa to Orlando or Tampa to Gainesville. So we have a perspective of driving in a car and how long it takes us to get. How would Israel fit inside the state of Florida? Did you know the whole country can fit inside the state of Florida? Boom. That's the country of Israel fitting inside the state of Florida. So that should, again, give you some perspective of the size of the country of Israel. It is not big. It is very easy to drive from one border to the other when you're inside the country because it's just simply not that big. Yet, as we know, Israel is a worldwide superpower, from a military standpoint. And yet it fits inside the state of Florida. So I always found that interesting. I think sometimes we lose perspective of how actually small the country is until we see something like this. So the geography, it has very diverse topography in a small confined area. On the west coast, you've got the Mediterranean coastal plain. In the north central area, you've got what's called the hill country and the mountains of the north. You've got the Great Rift Valley, which is on the east border. And I'm going to show you this in a map in just a minute. That's the lowest spot on earth. That's that Rift Valley that goes from the Sea of Galilee or Lake Tiberias. You got the Jordan River that's basically at the bottom of that rift, and it goes right into the Dead Sea. That's part of the Great Rift Valley, which is a low spot. And then you got the Negev, the whole bottom, almost third, maybe even more than a third of the country, they call the Negev, which is the desert. I mean, it is nothing but desert. There is nothing out there at all but sand and rocks. And that's a geographic area. So here's a map. So as you can see, when you look, here's where I need my pointer. When you look up kind of to the northwest and that whole area along the Mediterranean Sea, that's the coastal plain. Very fertile land, lots of green vegetation, almost beach-like areas, a bit more It's hilly, but pretty much flat. It did kind of remind me a little bit of Florida, or the coast of Texas, kind of a look about it. So that's the coastal area. Then in the middle, so you see where Jerusalem is, starting just north of Jerusalem, moving up through the middle of the state, middle of the country. That's the hill and the mountain area. And the more you get towards the top of the country up there, you actually get into some decent elevation and mountainous areas up there. Then you got the Rift Valley. As I said, you see the yellow border on the east side. That's a rift. I mean, that's that area that's negative 1,000 feet below sea level. And that's where the River Jordan is. And you got I need my pointer. You see the little body of water up there at the north area. That's the Sea of Galilee. Interesting, I'll come back to this eventually, but we call it a sea, and I think we naturally think sea being a salt water. So some sort of body of salt water, but that is not the case. The Sea of Galilee is actually a freshwater lake, also called Lake Tiberias. And that water runs out of the mountains of the north. It fills up the lake. And then the water runs out of the lake and runs, you can't really see it because I've got the yellow border, but that's the River Jordan. It runs down the River Jordan and into that second body of water that's kind of parallel to Jerusalem. That's the Dead Sea. And the water can no longer escape. The archaeologists and those that study, going back millions of years and everything, they will tell you that used to flow all the way down to the inlet to the Red Sea down at the bottom corner of the country, that the water would flow all the way down there and into the sea. Well, eventually that all dried up. And now what happens is all that salt water that used to be in there is trapped inside the Dead Sea. And as the water evaporates and it continues to shrink, that's why the salt content is so high. And the Dead Sea is one of the saltiest areas in the world. And I'll show pictures. You do the Dead Sea float, and it is a trip. It's unlike anything you've ever experienced, because you actually have to force your body to stay perpendicular to the water surface. It wants to pop you flat on your back every single time, because you're so buoyant, because the water is so salty and so thick and dense. But anyway, that's a little bit about the geography of modern Israel. So how did we get to modern Israel? So we're going to go through a bunch of slides that kind of goes over the history of Israel. Now, take some of this with the grain of salt. A lot of this, what it attempts to do is overlay the biblical narrative with what we know about the civilization that dates way back before they were really taking a lot of actual record. Archaeologists have to piece together what other civilizations might have wrote about this area in some of their writings or some of their carvings on like palace walls and things like that. Some of the reliefs in Egyptian palaces and Assyrian palaces where they might reference the Hebrews, and they can date that. And so some of this stuff, the dates, of course, are just ranges and they don't actually know for sure. But then as we move forward in history, then the dates get a bit more, specific as recorded history begin to document all the stuff. So here we go. Very brief history. Oh, I don't know. Well, so much for my animations working. They were supposed to hit one at a time. So as I said, very brief history. 1250 BCE, and for most of my presentation, I will use the BCE and the CE terminology, and that's primarily because that's kind of the scholastic terminology. It's CE and AD if you so choose, but for my dating, I was using the BCE. before Common Era, and then Common Era for the dating. And just remember BC, when we're talking about the BCE stuff, the dates go in reverse as you move forward in time because you're counting down to 0, right? So 1250, so 1,250 years basically before Christ, is when they think the conquest of Joshua would have happened. And that's if that even happened at all. There is significant scholarly debate of did the conquest of Joshua as we receive it in the biblical narrative exactly happen the way it was received in the biblical narrative? Or was it more of a migration of people into areas where they begin to take over areas and have smaller level skirmishes with the locals that were living there, and the population just begin to kind of blossom from within? We don't know. That's part of the catch. You know, some of this is so old, we don't have any real documentation. These are just archaeologists putting together pieces. But the point of this is around 1250 is when they think the Hebrew people would have entered this area, or as we receive it in the biblical narrative, when they entered the promised land. So about 1250 years ago, before Jesus. Between 1250 and 1000, so that's a long time period, by the way, a long time period. They think that that was roughly what they call the period of the judges. And in Holy Scripture, the period of the judges is relatively small in regards to the size of the number of books that we receive. This is like where the Samson story comes from, where the Deborah stories come from, and things like that. You know, when the Hebrew people moved into the Holy Land, they didn't have a king yet. They didn't have centralized leadership. They were operating more under a model of kind of tribal leadership, because they did have the 12 tribes, and they set them up, and they had their areas within Israel that were kind of their space. And each tribe had kind of elders and judges, and the judges were the ones that kind of oversaw and made major decisions. And that's why this is called the period of the judges. So this would be, they've established themselves in the area, but the king, you know, the kingdom hasn't come yet. There's no centralized king. Around 1000 to 930 would have been what they called the United Kingdom. Now, that's not the UK and England. This is the United Kingdom, where around 1000 is when they believe King Saul came into power. So King Saul was coronated king of Israel, and that's when the centralized leadership began. And you've got only 3 kings under the United Kingdom when they were all one body. And that's King Saul, King David, of course. King David followed King Saul, and then King Solomon. That was one of David's sons who succeeded him. And Solomon is the one who you know, got all the wisdom. He was the wise king, where Proverbs, supposedly a lot of Proverbs come from, and things like that. So these are the 3 kings under the United Kingdom of Israel. By the way, around 950 BCE is when the first temple is built. So King Solomon is responsible for building the first temple in Jerusalem. And they think that happened around 950. I mean, it took a long time to build. They just didn't build it in a year because it was a large structure and it took a while. But they think in the 950s approximately was when it was built. Moving forward, so here's what they believe the United Kingdom of Israel would have looked like. A bit different than what it looks like currently, right? Hold on a second. I'm looking at a chat real quick. I'll get back to that later, because I know people will post questions there too. This is what they believe it looked like. It kind of a bit more of a blob, and it reached into modern day Jordan and down into a little bit more into the Arabian Peninsula. But this is what roughly the United Kingdom would have resembled during the time of King David, King Solomon, and so on. Well, eventually, they split. There is a disagreement between the North and the South Kingdom. A lot of this, at least according to the biblical narrative, you still had a lot of the Jewish people that after they began to live in the area for a while, they were picking up a lot of the other local traditions and local faiths and local demigods and things like that. And especially if you read the biblical narrative, it always says that the Northern Kingdom and the Northern leaders and kings were doing what was evil in the sight of the Lord. The poor Northern Kingdom got bashed a lot. And it was primarily because they had broken their commitment to Yahweh and were in conjunction with worshiping Yahweh and God. They were also worshiping a lot of the other gods that were local to the area. There became a big disagreement between the North and the South. And the North just decided, well, we're going to set up our own king, and we're breaking off from you. And they split. And you had the Northern Kingdom, which is called Israel. And in the Southern Kingdom, which had Jerusalem in it, where the temple was, that was called Judah. So a lot of times when you're reading Old Testament Kings and Chronicles and things like that, and you hear the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, now you know what they were talking about. It was the split kingdoms. And this is roughly what they think it looked like. The Northern Kingdom was actually the much larger of the two of the kingdoms, but the Southern Kingdom had Jerusalem, and the Southern Kingdom had the kingship that, for the most part, in the biblical narrative, those kings did what was pleasing in the sight of the Lord. So you already see it's like the North was bad and the South was good, but that was not always the case. There was definitely a couple kings in the Southern Kingdom that did not do what they were supposed to, and that's when the prophets would come in and yell at them. But won't go into all that detail tonight. But anyway, you got the two kingdoms, and they split around 720 BCE. The Northern Kingdom falls. It is invaded by Assyria, the Assyrian Empire, and it falls. It is taken over. The Southern Kingdom had a better army. It was able to withstand the Assyrians, and plus the Assyrians were getting a bit too far from their home base. So they kind of simply took over the Northern Kingdom and let the Southern Kingdom be. So now the Northern Kingdom of Israel is no more. It doesn't even exist. It's been consumed by the Assyrian Empire. Well, eventually the Assyrians are conquered by the Babylonians. And the Babylonians then turn and say, we're going after the Southern Kingdom. And so you hear about Nebuchadnezzar, King Nebuchadnezzar. He was the Babylonian king. He comes in around, and in 587 BCE, he takes the Southern Kingdom. He takes over the kingdom. He sacks Jerusalem and destroys the temple. The first temple is now destroyed. It is laid in ruin. And what they call the Jewish exile begins. Nebuchadnezzar gathers up all of the remaining Hebrews or Jewish people and takes them back to Babylon and areas of Babylon. And they are not allowed to go back to their homeland. And this is the exile. So this is another area where we get a lot of the prophets, where the prophets are trying to keep the faithful believing that, no, God is still with us, even though we've lost everything, and God will eventually restore what we've lost. And so a lot of the prophets are popping up at this time frame, saying that all will be eventually restored. But the Southern Kingdom falls, and now there is no more Kingdom of Israel at all. Nothing. It has been demolished. And the whole territory, the whole area is now under Babylonian control. So there's yet another picture of that to show the northern and southern kingdoms. This is all now in charge. The Babylonians are in charge. The Babylonians, we'll skim over this quickly. The Babylonians rule from approximately 587 to 538. Now, keep in mind, this is who's ruling over this specific area that we now know as Israel. It doesn't necessarily mean this is the dates of their empire. This is just when they had control of the area of Israel. Babylonians from 587 to 538. Then the Persians conquer the Babylonians. And now the Persians have own all the territory that the Babylonians had. But the Persians do something a little different. The Persians they allowed the people that they conquered to practice their old faiths. And so this is where you get the story of Daniel, and then eventually Ezra, and then you get the people returning to the Holy Land. Daniel fell in favor with one of the Persian leaders, and then he's eventually followed up by who it is, but they talked the leader into allowing the Jewish exiles to go back to Jerusalem. Even though it's all still under Persian rule, they're allowed to go back to their homeland and begin to rebuild. And so the temple is now going to be rebuilt, but it is a far cry to what it used to be. They didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have a lot of resources. They're still living under Persian control, but they began to reconstruct the temple to the best of their abilities so that they could kind of reclaim that area and that space. So that's called the Second Temple era. It begins, and it's about 535. Well, eventually the Greeks come along and they take over the area, and the Greeks rule from 332 to 63. And then a little known thing called the Roman Empire comes rolling along and takes over literally everything in this area around the Mediterranean. They conquer all, and they will be in charge of this region from 63 BCE all the way to 313 CE. So this is through, as you can tell, the life of Jesus. Jesus lived through this time when the Romans were in charge of the area known as Israel. In 70 CE, so this is now after Jesus, all right? Jesus has lived his ministry, dies on the cross, crucified, put in the tomb, and is resurrected, and then ascends back to heaven. And the disciples, now the apostles, start spreading Christianity around the area. Well, there's a Jewish revolt in Jerusalem. The Jewish people revolt against the Roman Empire, and the emperor at the time, I looked it up and I forgot again, he decides, that's it, I've had it with all of the Jewish people, and he levels Jerusalem. I mean, there's nothing left when he gets done with Jerusalem. He rolls the Roman army in there and destroys Jerusalem. And now the Second Temple is destroyed along with it. By the way, I skipped over it. You know, when the Jewish people rebuilt the temple during the time of the Persians, it was a far cry. But eventually, when the Romans came to power, remember Herod the Great? Remember I was talking about Herod the Great? Herod the Great was a bit of a hybrid. He was half Jewish. So he had Jewish lineage, but he also had a lot of Roman loyalties. And so he had funding, and he had a lot of position. And to try to win the people over, Herod the Great, and why he's called Herod the Great, is he took what was the rebuild of the Second Temple and then turned it into this massive monstrosity of a temple, far exceeded the original size of the original temple. It was Herod the Great that made the temple that Jesus would have walked around. And it was this huge structure and building. It was so big, they had to build up the ground around it just so that the base was big enough to hold it all. And when we get to Jerusalem, the history of Jerusalem, we'll talk more about that. But Herod the Great builds up the Second Temple to this new grandeur. And then in 70, the Romans destroy it. And they destroy it for good. The temple will never be rebuilt even to this day after this point. But he doesn't stop there. The Roman Empire chases the random Jewish groups that are all over the region and basically puts to death as many of them as he can. All the holdouts that were in various areas, he executes many of them, hundreds and thousands of them. And that begins what they call the Jewish Diaspora, where they flee the whole area. They're not even in Israel anymore. They go north, south, and east to flee the Roman persecution. And they basically leave the homeland at that point until more the modern era. We'll get to that. So moving forward, eventually the Roman Empire does fall, or it splits apart is what it does, and then eventually falls. But this area falls under the control of the Byzantines from 313 to 636. Then a guy by the name Muhammad in what we now know as Iraq starts preaching. And around 610 CE, he starts preaching, and he's having these visions that he claims come from the angel Gabriel, and he starts telling the people about it. People start writing down what he's saying. It starts a movement. It starts a religious movement, and that is what we now know as Islam. So Islam begins to spread after the death of Muhammad in 610. And in the area that we now know as Iraq, but then it begins to burst and grow and spread, which is why at 636, the Arabs, fueled primarily by this Islamic movement, they take over the area from the Byzantines. And so now for the first time, this area is under Islamic control. All right, it was Christian, the Byzantines were Christian. And then now in 636, all the way to 1099, that's a long time, it is now under Islamic control. And within that time frame, around 691 is when the Dome of the Rock is built. And when you see pictures of Israel, that's kind of like one of the iconic things that you always see of Jerusalem, which is the Dome of the Rock, which is this right here. This is an Islamic shrine. It is the third holiest site in all of Islam. And we'll get to that. I'm going to do a whole thing on the Dome of the Rock later when we get to our Jerusalem section. But the Dome of the Rock is the third holiest site in Islam behind Mecca and then Medina. Mecca is what they believe to be the original site where Abraham lived, and Abraham's house and things like that. And really the birthplace of the faith. And then Medina is Muhammad's homeland, or his hometown. That's why it's the second holiest site. And then the Dome of the Rock is the third holiest site. But then a little group called the Crusaders, you probably heard about them. Around 1099 to 1291, the Crusaders, the Christian Crusaders, take back this area around Jerusalem for the Christian church. It doesn't last too terribly long. 1291 to 1556, the Mamelukes, which until I did this teaching, I'd never heard of them. The Mamelukes run this area and they return it back to being Islamic, right? So now it's back to being Islamic, 1516 to 1917. So now we're getting into the 20th century. The Ottomans had control over this area. And the Ottomans, one of the things that's important to note here, the Ottomans are the group that began to call this region Palestine. All right. So the people that lived there for, what's that, 400, almost 400 years, way longer than we've been a country, the Ottomans called the region Palestine, and that's why the people that were living there began to be known as the Palestinians. All right. And they were all Islamic. All right. But around the same time frame, the Jews that were spread out all over began to slowly return to the area in little pockets. There was a desire to get back to their holy land, Jerusalem and such. And so they slowly begin to return. Well, then in 1914 to 1918, we have a little fight called World War I. That goes on. The reason why that's important is because following World War I, now the area is controlled by the British. And the British allow a bigger explosion of the Jewish population to begin to take hold of the area. In 1917, they have something called the Balfour Declaration, right? And what it did was it actually supported the establishment of a Jewish homeland. So at this point in time, you know, it had been Palestinian area for a long time. The Jewish people have been coming back into the area post World War I. And now there's a declaration, since it's British controlled, to say, hey, let's start thinking about sectioning off a area of this land for the Jewish people, because it was their homeland that they were kicked out of a long time ago. So that begins to roll. In 1922, the Balfour Declaration is approved by the League of Nations. But then in 1939 and 1945, we have another big worldwide fight called World War II. And that goes on. And then, of course, that included the Jewish Holocaust. At the end of the war, in 1947, I believe, and this is the one thing that I think the area was still in control of the British even after the war. But they were having much looser ties to it. I think it was almost becoming a thorn in their side, and they kind of wanted it to go away. The United Nations, after World War II, then approves the partitioning of Palestine into a Jewish and an Arab state. So they decide, all right, we're just going to split it. All right, so the Arabs or the Palestinians, you can have this spot, and the Jewish people, you can have this spot. So this would have been the proposed map. The red would have been the Palestinian part, and the blue would have been the Jewish part. Now you can probably understand why the Jewish people were unhappy with the map. The reason is the whole, remember I said at the beginning, the whole southern half is nothing but desert. It's nothing but desert, and that's a bulk of what they were given. They weren't given the Holy Land. They weren't given the holy city of Jerusalem. That's all in the red zone there. And so, but they got a good bit of the fertile coastal area, right? So that's how it was right after World War II and the partitioning. Well, in 1948, and now we might be getting into the life of those who are on the call. In 1948, on May 14th, the Israelis declare independence. And they are going to now take over the whole space. There's the War of 1948, and it involved the Jewish people, or the Israelis, versus Egypt, Syria, the Transjordan, Lebanon, and Iraq. They took on all 5 countries. A year later, 1949, there was an armistice agreement. All the countries were involved except Iraq. I think Iraq, in that case, they didn't have any skin in the game because they weren't bordering the country. I think they were just joining the fight. But then the agreement didn't really involve them because there was no border contested with Iraq. So this is what the armistice agreement would have looked like. And now we're getting into what modern day Israel kind of resembles. The peach color is the Israeli area, which now is a much larger chunk of the country. You've got 2 demilitarized zones that were just these neutral areas that they decided weren't going to go to one country or another. You've got the blue area. You see the little blue area right next to the Mediterranean Sea? That remained under Egypt control. By the way, that is also now known as the Gaza Strip, if that makes sense. You had a lot of Egyptians in the area, some Christians, but still a lot of the Palestinians living in that area that were under the control of Egypt. But it's a little protrusion into the country of Israel. And then you had the green part that was under the control of Jordan. Jordan is the neighboring country there. Jordan maintained control of that green area. By the way, that's now what we know the West Bank, and it included Jerusalem. And still, that was primarily Islamic and Palestinian populated areas. All right, so 1948 till today, let's just sum it all up as there has been multiple wars, multiple conflicts all over the border and statehood of who's controlling what and this and that. And then we get to this. This is modern day Israel. You've got the Gaza Strip, the West Bank. Now, what's important to note, I brought up the wrong teaching. Pause for just a second. Aha, I knew I was missing something. I had y'all in the short teaching. Let me go back to where we were. Here we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so where were we? The armistice agreement, multiple conflicts over borders and statehood. However, one that is of importance, in 1967, you did have the 6-Day War. And in the 6-Day War, that was against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. It only lasted from June 5th to June 10th in 1967. Now, what's important about
You're not sharing.
6-Day War is Israel fought back around all of its borders, and it took over the entire Sinai Peninsula, which used to be controlled by Egypt. It took the Gaza Strip area, it took the West Bank area, and it took the Golan Heights area. They took all of this area as a component of the 6-Day War. But ultimately, they would, and this was contested, it was fought, there were a lot of smaller skirmishes over them, over the Israel taking over these areas. So in 1978, which is the year I was born, which is kind of crazy, they had the Camp David Accords. And they finally signed a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. And Israel would withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. And then Jordan and Egypt would eventually withdraw their claims on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So if we go back to this meeting, this slide, remember the area that we now know as the West Bank, that was controlled by Jordan. And the area known as the Gaza Strip was controlled by Egypt. Well, after this, the Camp David Accords, they basically gave back the Sinai Peninsula, but then they maintained control of the Gaza Strip and now the West Bank. And this is where it gets a little tricky.
Yeah, you're not sharing your screen, sir.
Screens aren't showing.
The reason why this gets tricky is, see, remember, the West Bank used to be controlled by Jordan and was primarily Palestinian and Islamic. And the Gaza Strip was controlled by Egypt, and it was a mix of Christians and Islams, but it was under the jurisdiction of Egypt. Where this really gets complicated is Israel, after the Camp David Accords, maintains what we would call a military sovereignty over the larger border. But what has ended up developing are these micro governments. So the West Bank is still Palestinian controlled. And to keep the peace, the Israelis and the Palestinians set this up so that the Palestinians would have an area of their own. And you got to go through border checks. Like if you drive from the orange area into the green area, you have to go through a border stop just to get in and to get back out of this area, almost as if it's a different country, but it's not a different country from a military standpoint because it's all still Israel, and Israel claims it as its own territory and sovereignty. However, the kind of governmental jurisdiction of the West Bank is run by Palestinian leaders. And so it's almost like a country within a country. And that's why there's so much conflict between the two. The Gaza Strip is the same thing. It's like its own small micro economy, micro governance within the technical borders of Israel, but it's run by a separate people. And again, that's why there's so much conflict between the Israelis and the people in the Gaza Strip. So that's roughly how we got to where we are today. So what I want to do right now is I'm going to stop screen sharing. Oh, I never did the screen share again, did I? Oh, no. See, this is why when things go wrong on live stream and Facebook, it's quite embarrassing. We got a few minutes. Let me bring that back up. Hold on a minute. Y'all just got to hear me talk. That was probably very unexciting for a minute. If I had picked the right presentation at the beginning, none of this would have happened. Here we go. All right. Yay. There we go. All right. So what I was talking about here. So I got the map up again. So basically you can see how the area of the West Bank, you know, that used to be Jordanian controlled. And after the Camp David Accords, it became sovereign Israel, but yet it still has this micro government within itself that is Palestinian run. And where a lot of the tension comes from is, guess who's got all the money? Israel. They have the power, they have the military, and they have all the funding. And basically the people in the West Bank are in a totally different economical chain. And life is a lot harder in the West Bank, but they want to maintain their kind of governmental sovereignty and control of the area. And so that's why there's so much tension there between the two. Something similar is going on down in the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip there used to belong to Egypt, and now though it's technically within the border of Israel, it's its own little micro government. And again, they struggle for resources and things like that, because look how small it is. That's to import everything and to survive. And so there's a lot of negative tension between them and the greater Israel. A lot of people are like, well, why don't you just become one big country and be happy? Well, thousands of years of conflict and fighting tends to leave people bitter, and they just don't want to give up their area. They're not willing to kind of play a little nice how we are in the United States with our multiple states and state governments and national government, things like that. They can't play as nice as we can. And so it gets very, very tricky. And so we just have a few more minutes. I'm not going to go to the next section. I think what we'll do is we'll stop here tonight. And I do see that there are some hands for some questions. So what I'll do is I will, let's open up for questions and see who's got some questions tonight. Brian Jacobson, you got your hand up. You want to go? You will have to unmute yourself.
Well, I was just going to let you know that your screen was not being shared.
Oh, say again, Brian.
I was just trying to let you know that your screen was not being shared.
Yeah. Sorry
about that.
Yeah, that was my mistake. It's so hard to tell on my end that I wasn't sharing the screen. So I'm a rookie at this style teaching and presentation. I will get it better as we go. Other questions from other folks that might be on the actual Zoom call that, go ahead, Michelle.
You mentioned the fact that there were people that were in Gaza and all the different delineations, and you called some of them Christians. I just want us to understand why they were different than the Palestinians, because I know a lot of Palestinian people myself, and they are Christian. So just because you're Palestinian doesn't mean you're Muslim, or if you're Israeli, you're not necessarily always Jewish, I guess. So I was just wondering why you had that differentiation.
You are correct. There are lots of Palestinian Christians. Now, the majority are still Islamic, but there are definitely Palestinian Christians. And then in Egypt and also in Gaza Strip, you've got the Coptic Christians that come from Egypt. And then you've got Christians even running around Jerusalem and Israel itself that are not Jewish. So yeah, you are correct. The history of it lends itself to the Palestinians being primarily Islamic, but that is not. It is not like a black and white kind of a line. There are a lot of Palestinian Christians in the area because where did Jesus do his ministry and where? Right in this area. I mean, this area was heavily Christian all the way up until the Arab invasion. And so many of those communities would carry on in the midst of all that. And there's plenty. In fact, our tour company that we were that actually did the buses and our local guide, he was a Palestinian Christian. He was Lutheran, I think. He was a Palestinian Lutheran Christian, and a wonderful guy. But he'd lived in the area the whole life, and he would give us a very interesting perspective, especially when we started talking about some of the Israeli and the Palestinian dynamics that are local. He gave us a really interesting perspective because his perspective was coming from like a minority within a minority group, a Palestinian Christian, and his experience. And he was a wonderful Christian. I mean, he could teach like you wouldn't believe the scriptures, and he wasn't even the expert on the tour. We had a PhD of New Testament and of the Holy Land actually being our primary teacher on the pilgrimage, but Faraj was his name. He was the local Palestinian Christian. He was awesome. He could tell you all kind of cool stuff about the sites and the local sites, and he would correlate it to the Gospels very, very well. And so, it gets, from, like I said at the beginning, this was a brief, non-detailed history. So I was definitely using some generalizations. But by far is it detailed? Just like us, our own history in this country, it is detailed and nuanced like you wouldn't believe. And if someone were to do what I just did, it would come across, very kind of delineated and stereotyped. But the reality is this area is deeply rich with a lot of unique traditions that you can't just cut and dry. All these people are Palestinian and Islamic, and all the Jewish people are all the Israelis are Jewish, and that is totally not the case. But the point was to kind of go over a bit of the history of why it's kind of muddy and complicated, and it's been the leadership and the power has been transferred so many times in this area. So when we start talking about the sites that are there, it'll make a little more sense when I start talking about, well, we don't know, because you got to remember this thing was destroyed 5 times in its history, and what you see now is not what it used to be, because of all the various kingdoms and governments and wars and things like that have happened. So that was a good question. I didn't mean to overgeneralize there. Other questions? Bueller? All right. Well, it's 7:30, and I did a lot of talking. I know that was a big, sweeping history. And a lot to absorb. I saw people taking pictures of the slides and stuff like that. I mean, I can make this stuff available to you if you wish. I'd have to figure out a way to do that. Or you can just email me and I can give you some of this stuff if you want the specifics. But starting next week, what we'll do is we will, that's when we'll dive into some of the specific sites. We'll start, I'll dive into a little bit about the pilgrimage and some of the places that we saw, because I got some wonderful pictures of the landscape and the desert and some of the things that we got to see. And then the actual sites themselves and the history of the sites. And I'll, some of it I'll give my own personal commentary on what it was like to experience a holy site when your mind is going two totally different directions. You know, I'm a science guy. I have my bachelor's is in molecular biology, and everything that I do, I approach from a scientific standpoint always. And so I'm wrestling with the historicity of everything. Like, all right, well, how do you actually know this is the cave where Jesus was born? Because it was 2,000 years ago, and there's been all these wars and fighting. And just because Constantine said this is where it is it true or not? And you're wrestling with that, or at least I am in my own head. But then I stop and pause and have the spiritual moment, which is, well, does it matter? You know, or we know it happened somewhere right around here. And this is an important place. And doesn't just mark the event, and is the event and knowing that the event happened more important than simply knowing exactly where it happened. So I'll let you know a little bit of my wrestlings there when we went through the various sites as well. So, but if there's no other questions, I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and wrap things up tonight, and then we will do the same exact thing next week. I'll make sure I got my PowerPoints lined up better and not do the wrong one. But hopefully that this was helpful, you know, as we engage in when we begin to move around the map of the Holy Land, a little bit of knowing the history, I find is very helpful, because we are going to travel back in time now when we do start talking about the life of Jesus and stuff. And you got to remember the landscape was a bit different. And we got to go backwards in time a little bit to understand how we got there. So that's it. I thank everybody for tuning in, and I will see you all, some of y'all on Sunday, and then I'll see some of y'all next Wednesday night. So until then, blessings be with you, and I'll talk to y'all later. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Take
Hi, thank
care.
you.